Bonjour, bon lundi matin, lundi après-midi à tous. Welcome to today's webinar, Building Adaptation Skills for Planners. This webinar is the second of 7 that will comprise the series Building Adaptation Skills for a Changing Climate. This fall series will share experiences on how to build climate change adaptation skills. So my name is Dominique Auger, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar, and I'm a policy analyst at Natural Resources Canada in the Climate Change, Impact and Adaptation Division. Donc avant de poursuivre, je tiens à souligner que je suis située dans la ville de Québec, où les territoires traditionnels et de traités de plusieurs Premières Nations se rencontrent, dont le territoire de la nation Huron-Wendat. I also recognize that we're all working in a different place, and therefore you're working on another Indigenous territory. So I will encourage you to take a moment to reflect on that. So the webinar today is made possible with funding support from Natural Resources Canada, Canada's climate change adaptation platform, and the Building Regional Adaptation Capacity and Expertise Program, better known as BRACE. Next slide, please. So BRACE was a 5-year program. Oh, you can move again, please. Slides. Yeah, excellent. BRACE was a 5-year program funded under the Pan-Canadian framework. So the program wrapped up in March 2022, and it funded 20 projects across several teams, including planners, to increase capacity of organization, professionals, communities, and businesses to adapt. So my colleague will put the link to the BRACE webpage in the chat box, so you can have a look at the project funded by BRACE, as well as a few results there. So the webinar series, you can go back one slide, please. Yeah, excellent. The webinar series that you can see on this slide will feature work done on the BRACE program, but also other related initiatives. And today you'll hear about 3 projects that were targeting professional planners a bit more specifically, or that used approaches that could be applied to a wide range of audiences, such as planners. So presenters will briefly introduce their project, the resources they developed, and they will highlight key messages, learnings that are transferable to others interested in building adaptation skills. Note from this slide that the webinar key consideration for upskilling the workforce of tomorrow, this one has been scheduled for October 11th. So you can take note of that one, and the other one will be scheduled a bit later. So a few technical information before we start. So Claire Sanders from the Climate Risk Institute is your technical support person for the webinar, and she is available if you run into audio or technical issue. You can click on the chat box and find her name in the drop-down menu of participant and send her a direct message. Note that your microphones have been muted to avoid any audio distraction or feedback during the webinar. And we'll have at the end a dedicated Q&A session, but that doesn't mean that you have to hold your questions until then. So you can use the Q&A box to ask your questions, and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. The chat box is also available if you'd like to submit comments. And note that the presentation today will be in English. Les présentations aujourd'hui seront en anglais. Mais soyez bien à l'aise de poser vos questions en français, il n'y a pas de problème. So we are recording the webinar today, and we'll be sending out a link to everyone who has registered, along with a copy of the presentation slides after. So on behalf of everyone, next slide, please. Excellent, thanks. On behalf of everyone joining us, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our speakers today, Megan Gereghty, Christy Allen, and Joe Rario. And without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Megan Gereghty. Hi, Megan. So Megan is a climate change adaptation planner with the Climate Risk Institute. As a registered professional planner, Megan is passionate about climate change adaptation and resilience community development. Megan has experience and expertise in development, land use, and policy planning projects. Her work focuses on the advancement of climate change adaptation training for planners. And today, Megan will talk about planners training and the adaptation resource pathway. So Megan, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much, Dominique. Hi, everyone. I'd just like to start by saying thank you to NRCan for hosting this webinar. I'll be speaking to you today about our training and some of the adaptation resource pathway document features. Next slide, please. So I'll start with a short intro on the Climate Risk Institute. We're just a nonprofit, academically affiliated organization with a mission to advance practice and deliver services related to climate change risk assessment, adaptation planning, policy evaluation, and resiliency. Training is a very important part of what we do at CRI. We draw on the expertise of our staff, but also importantly, a very strong group of CRI associates. Next slide, please. To start, we've all seen messages from the IPCC and others that we need urgent action to adapt to climate change, while at the same time looking to cut greenhouse gas emissions, because as we know, our collective effort on adaptation becomes much, much more difficult as emissions continue to increase. So we're already seeing effects of climate change impacting people all over the world, including here in Canada. Next slide. Thankfully, planners and other community development professionals have a number of existing skills that can help to incorporate climate actions into our communities. So for example, some planners are accustomed to working with long-term projections for things like growth planning and other things. So they already have experience handling really big questions that come along with a lot of uncertainty. Some planners also work to develop plans that are used as guide for future development. So experiencing taking action through policy creation and then through the implementation of those policies. Planners typically have strong connections, many other professions, government officials, agencies, and the public. So their knowledge and experience in speaking with various audiences and bringing them together can be very useful in communicating about climate change. And lastly, there's a strong connection between design and climate change adaptation as well. Things like natural and green infrastructure solutions can really go a long way in incorporating mitigation and adaptation actions. Next slide, please. In 2018, the Canadian Institute of Planners released a policy on climate change planning with a goal of creating a future where communities are planned and developed to contribute to climate change stability and to be more resilient in the face of unavoidable climate change. And they put out a call to action that recognizes that all planners have an ethical obligation to consider climate change in their practice. And also CIP strives themselves to ensure that members have access to the resources and supports that they need to do so. In 2019, CIP also undertook a benchmarking survey of planners in partnership with NRCan through Brace funding. And the survey covered a broad range of themes around climate change. And the results showed that only about 15% of planners felt that they had access to the necessary tools and information to incorporate climate change into their work, even though a variety of information and tools existed. The survey also concluded that training would be helpful to increase professional understanding and confidence in incorporating climate change. Next slide. In support of these findings, CRI, in partnership with others, other contributors and partners, develops climate change adaptation and resilience training for planners in both Ontario and the Prairie region. And as a separate project, we created an interactive resource specifically geared towards helping planners navigate climate change adaptation resources. Both projects were supported with funding made available through the Brace program. Next slide, please. So I'll start with a bit of an overview of the training program. So CRI, again, was involved in creating the two separate courses, one for Ontario, one for the Prairie region. They're developed in support of some of the planning institutes in Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, as well as support from CIP. Partners involved in the course development and delivery of the training included experts and leaders in climate, risk, adaptation, and planning from CRI, as well as Dillon Consulting Limited for the Ontario version of the training, and All One Sky Foundation and Wallace Insights for the Prairie region training. We're extremely privileged to provide a forum for our partners to share their knowledge and expertise through this training, and it's been great working with them all so far. Next slide, please. The focus of the training is to build capacity for planners to related to climate change adaptation. A challenge in creating the training was determining the level of detail that would be most appropriate. So planning is a very diverse profession with planners working in the public, private and non-government spaces and at different levels of government, and with different specializations. So things like urban design, transportation, or environment planning, and that type of thing. Our training needed to be general enough to demonstrate the importance of incorporating climate change adaptation considerations into planning more generally, while also being specific enough to help people see how they as individual professionals could make changes to their work specifically. So this slide just shows the basic structure of the original Prairie Region training. Each module is made up of 2.5-hour sessions focused on 3 themes: the science and policy of climate change, adaptation planning and risk assessment processes, and the implementation of how planners can start to incorporate those actions into their work. Along the way, we also focused on communication best practices based on the content in each of those modules. It's a comprehensive course with interactivity built in throughout to explore some of the concepts. And at the end, participants receive a certificate of participation. We also are finishing up 3 elective modules that will dive deeper into communication, climate justice, and climate impacts and vulnerabilities. They'll be about an hour long each, and they'll be recorded as a supplement to the other training. Next slide, please. Just a few notes on guidance and oversight. Course review committee members were invaluable in molding the content for these courses. They provided input on the overall course structure and general content covered in the training. We had separate committees for the Ontario and Prairie Region training, and the comments were different based on their perspectives and collective experience about what was happening in each of those areas. So the modules are slightly different for either version of the training. We're now working on transitioning the training to a learning management system platform through a new partnership with Royal Roads University, and believe that this will provide more opportunity for participants to interact with one another and to network. We also think that the mix of self-paced recorded content and live sessions will help keep things more flexible, and hopefully will be easier for people to fit into their schedules. It will also provide a new platform for us to confirm people's learning along the way with quizzes and discussion boards and other things that you would get in that type of platform. Next slide, please. So the second project CRI was involved in, also funded through BRACE, was focused on compiling resources for planners. We know that doing a simple Google search of climate change adaptation or planning can be quite overwhelming. So, and it's also difficult to know where to start. So this project is really intended to simplify things through this interactive adaptation resource pathway document, or ARP for short. In total, there are 4 topics that were explored, which are listed on the slide here. So CRI was in charge of developing the land use, urban and regional planning resource. So the ARP was created with guidance from NRCan and with experts working on the other documents as well, and from a group of fantastic volunteer committee members that have a wide range of expertise in climate change and planning. And with their help, we curated this document, which is now available through our CRI website, as well as the BRACE Resources website. Basically, the document is broken down into 5 main categories. Explore, outlines key terms and questions, and provides a list of curated resources that are displayed in categories to try and help narrow down people's search. Learn provides options for training and other, well, including CRI's planners training that I was just speaking about. Network provides options for communities of practice and ideas to help keep people informed and connected. ACT includes examples for inspiration, and Reflect provides some guidance around monitoring and evaluation. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I think one more slide. So here's what the output looks like. It's now available through the CRI website and the BRACE resource page. The biggest advantage of the resources are that it provides access to information in an organized way, so it's easier to find relevant information faster. The resources have been vetted through experts. The ARP is not only a resource for more reading materials, but as I mentioned, has training, networking options as well. The initial information within the key concepts and definitions at the beginning of the document also help to set the stage and provide good starting point to help people get the basic understanding of what they need to know before jumping in. Some of the barriers to the document are that because it's a PDF, it's a little bit harder to keep things up to date. As we know, there's a lot of material coming out around climate change adaptation, so there's new links and things that might be of interest. As well, just making sure that the links all work over time, and it currently is only available in English. So we're hoping that in future there'll be some additional funding to keep this updated on an annual basis to keep everything fresh and up to date. Next slide, please. So we're asked to highlight some key messages and learning that we encountered throughout the creation of these projects, and to explain what is transferable to others in terms of developing climate change adaptation training initiatives. So some of those messages are that there's definitely a need for this kind of training, and that from what we've seen, planners are interested in learning more. In particular, people want to see or read about examples from others where things have worked and where things haven't worked. There may also be a benefit and from some more specific training as well here to key topics. We've found that committees are very, very helpful in the creation of content to check for relevance and appropriateness. In the training, people like having opportunities to discuss concepts with others and to make connections. So that's very important to give people those opportunities where possible. And lastly, there are many competing topics that require planners' attention and focus. And so providing information in an organized way with examples and opportunities for follow-up really seems to be critical to overall success. So we've learned a tremendous amount about online delivery and resource creation through these projects, and we hope our training and resources continue to evolve and improve to ensure our audiences and planning are able to take lessons from our content and translate them directly into practice. We're hosting some upcoming training for the Ontario and Prairie region planners, and looking forward to carrying on with the training in the future. Thanks so much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much, Megan. Very interesting. And thanks for presenting these two components of your projects. And we have some links at the end as well. So if people, we added it to a slide, so you'll have access to the links again at the end. Let's see, I'll just checking if there's any clarification questions. And I'm not seeing any, but again, as I mentioned, we'll be open to a Q&A at the end with more broadly, broader questions at the end of the three presentations. So seeing none clarification question, I'd like to now introduce Christy Allen. So Christy is a research manager at the Prairie Climate Centre at the University of Winnipeg. She manages the center's activity, which focus on evidence-based communication of the science, impacts, and risks of climate change through maps, documentary video, research reports, and plain language training, writing, and outreach. So Christy will present Planning a Climate Resilience Manitoba. So over to you, Christy.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and I hope everyone is doing really well today. Getting into a Monday kind of nicely. I'm going to talk about the Manitoba version of BRACE, so the Manitoba Climate Resilience Training Program, and the work that we did for the planning sector with that. So next slide, please. I think just to start, on the heels of the second National Truth and Reconciliation Day, I'm going to acknowledge the territory that we come to you from. So I'm at the University of Winnipeg, which is on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Dakota people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In Winnipeg, our water comes from Shoal Lake 40, which is in the Treaty 3 territory, and the electricity that lets me come to you today through my computer and the Wi-Fi is generated from infrastructures on treaty areas 1, 3, and 5. Next slide, please. Dominic did a great overview of the Prairie Climate Centre, but just to reiterate, we are a centre at the University of Winnipeg, and we do our best to make climate change meaningful. We do this through a couple of tools, but lots of plain language writing, documentary filmmaking, really just trying to make climate change real and relevant. And we know that really is dependent on location and regional considerations and all of those nice things that make it really local to you. We do this through a really transdisciplinary team. We have really fantastic people, climatologists, adaptation specialists, filmmakers, social scientists, and people like me who are just kind of jack of all trades, maybe everything and nothing. Next slide, please. One of the tools that we really do this from, if you haven't seen it, I recommend you go check it out, is the Climate Atlas of Canada. It's, among other things, there's lots of reports and written things to look at to help explain climate change, but one of the main tools we have is this interactive map where you can click in and see the climate futures for all of Canada, wherever you are. It makes climate change real and relevant. Right now we have the base layer in this picture is all of the Indigenous, and this one is First Nations in particular, communities in Canada, but we have municipalities, Inuit, and Métis projects. So you can go and take a look at that and see what climate change looks at in the area that you are coming from at the moment. Next slide, please. Today I'm talking to you about the Manitoba Climate Resilience Training Program. If you were on the last call or the last webinar, Kurt Hull did a really good job of explaining the project itself, but the approach Manitoba took was to highlight 4 different sectors, which planning was run by us, Northern Business was run by Dillon Consulting, Infrastructure, Engineers and Geoscientists Manitoba, and Prairie Climate Centre also ran the Indigenous work. And the overall coordination was done by ICLEI and the government of Manitoba. Overall, we produced 18 really great courses. Some of them are foundational, so cross-sectoral in nature, and others really get into the details of what climate change means to those specific sectors. And all of the recordings are still publicly available on the Climate West website, and they were all offered for free too as we went through the process. And as noted, this is a BRACE webinar, and with the funding support of Natural Resources Canada through the BRACE program as well was what got this through. I would note that this project was only 18 months as opposed to 3 years. So I feel like I have an easier job than the other people on the call trying to recap 18 months of work as opposed to 3 years. Next slide, please. So before you get really attached and think I'm a planner and super smart, I would just like to flag that I'm not. And I wasn't the lead on the project either. But one of the things that we do at the Prairie Climate Centre quite regularly, given our expertise in climate, is we partner with people. And so we partnered with HTFC Planning and Design to deliver this project. And it was a fantastic partnership. And from our team, Stephen Muirhead actually led the project. He is no longer, he's moved on to good things, being a landscape architect. But I will say, given there's the names of 8 other males as the only female on there, I'm going to take credit for the success of the project today as we go through this call. So any accolades, it's 2022, I can do that. But yeah, so just noting there was lots of really great supports for this project, and I am just here to speak on behalf of it. Next slide, please. So maybe just a bit of context. I looked a bit at the registration list and there wasn't too many people from Manitoba. So I'm just going to flag what Manitoba's looking like in terms of climate change. A few quick slides just so you all think about Manitoba briefly for a second, recognize where we are on a map. But I think one of the first things that's really worth flagging is that our winters are warming. Given that we are a cold province, people call us winter peg. It's actually quite a dramatic thing to deal with. Both socially, my identity comes a bit from being able to survive really cold winters. Also, it's one of the ways I carry out conversation when I leave the province. I say winter peg, but it also means a great deal for our planning, whether it's with respect to infrastructures or municipalities, or even in the north, when you're looking at some of the permafrost in the north end of the province, it's a big deal. Next slide, please. Similarly, we are a province in a place that goes from -30 to +30. Also difficult to plan for, but something that we're a little bit used to, but we're getting many more hot days and heat waves, which many of us know is a huge issue in terms of municipal planning, what cooling spaces look like, what infrastructure looks like, what is required. So we're getting warmer and losing the cold. Next slide, please. We're also no stranger to weird weather events. We get snowstorms, ice storms. This is one that happened in 2019. I remember it very vividly. I went into work and came out and the world looked like this, a bunch of trees down and lots of cars stuck. So that's just one of the many. Next slide, please. We are also no stranger to flooding here in Manitoba, and it's something that we try our best to plan for, but despite best efforts, it still tends to happen every odd year. This year in particular was a flood year, but the one represented here was in 2014. And as we noticed, you have the total estimated cost of both of these events at the bottom of the screen. And we know that this is just the monetary costs of some of the infrastructure damage and things like that. As we all look to the East Coast right now, we know that there is a lot more with respect to emotional and sentimental value of things that are lost as well. So it is something that we tend to deal with in terms of variability. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for our approach to helping planners deal with climate change? And so what are planners dealing with? To quote the ever brilliant Jeff Frank, hotter, drier, wetter, weirder. That's what we're getting in Manitoba, and we need to prepare for the variability and uncertainty. As we know in Manitoba, I just noted we're used to variability, but now it's becoming even more so. And the simple understated word in that sentence is, how do we prepare? What does that mean? What does it look like? That's what we sort of tried to do with this program series. So next slide, please. So our goal over the course of the project was to equip planners in Manitoba with the ability to understand climate change, how it affects their planning and design decisions, and help determine what steps they can take. And so there was kind of 3 phases to the project. First was engagement and audience identification and market gap analysis. Then we developed the content, and then we delivered the content. Fairly straightforward. Next slide, please. One of the more complicated things that working in climate I've always figured is just identifying audience and being able to scope it appropriately. So our audience for this project was professional planners, landscape architects, and to a bit of a lesser degree was watershed planners and municipal decision makers. In the reflections, I'll touch on just how the importance of scoping audience in terms of developing content. How did we engage them? We partnered with them for starters. We partnered with HDFC Planning and Design. We also connected with the professional bodies here, so Manitoba Professional Planners Institute and the Manitoba Association of Landscape Architects, MALAN and PPI, as well as universities. And we conducted workshops, kind of facilitated workshops for dialogue, as well as a survey. And I'll go into a few of the survey results because they were really interesting, and as the engagement workshops are interesting as well, but trying to recap oodles of conversation seems like it would take more than my 13 minutes. So next slide, please. So we tried to establish a baseline of where professional planners were in Manitoba with respect to climate change. We captured about 10 to 15% of the audience of professional planners and landscape architects. And just worth noting that 91% of them thought that climate change was somewhat, very, or extremely important to their work. Next slide, please. However, on a scale of 1 to 10, demand for climate conscious work was at a 3, so relatively low. So what does this mean? If it's an important thing, but there's little demand for it, why is that? Next slide, please. So when we got to the question around what are the barriers and limitations to incorporating climate change, funding was the first one, but that being said, funding is always the first barrier to everything. So let's move to the next one, which is the client disinterest. And so what does this mean? It means that there's little demand, but planners find it very, very important that there's climate change. So that puts planners kind of at the interface of communicating with their clients to explain why those climate conscious decisions should be made in their planning process. But as we get to the 4th barrier, lack of expertise is also one of those. So next slide, please. And then on a scale of 1 to 10, we asked professionals how confident they felt in discussing climate change, and also down on the lower end of the scale is the average of about 3 out of 10. So there's kind of needing to communicate to the client these climate change decisions are important, but not feeling necessarily confident in being able to communicate that. So then we took all of this information away. Next slide, please. And we went to work in the content development phase. This is Stephen here working diligently in the front as Homer. I'm definitely the person running in the background in the fire. I'm surprised my head's not cut off. But anyway, next slide, please. So content development goes on, and then we deliver our courses. So knowing that planners and honestly across the sectors, people are feeling like they could use more information about climate change. We had the wonderful Danny Blair delivering Climate Change 101. So he is a professor in geography and our resident climatologist. And just went through the basics of what is climate change. We also went through the basics of sort of what is happening internationally with respect to climate change in terms of some of the accords, and also what is being done in Canada. This was a wildly popular session, I would say. Didn't quite trend on TikTok, but we definitely got a lot of views, and there was a lot of interest within the province, outside of the province, and across sectors. So this one wasn't delivered to just planners, but infrastructure, northern business, Indigenous communities. there was a lot of demand for this. Next slide, please. We continued with our effort to kind of educate planners and those in Manitoba about how to integrate climate change. And to do that, we really understand and know that adaptation is definitely a localized context. And so we start to talk about what climate change looks like in Manitoba. What is it that is different about Manitoba than other places in the world? We talked about some of those variabilities, the flooding. How are we addressing it? You need to know what's happening before you can address it. And then we went into a bit of the kind of the broad, what is Manitoba doing to talk about climate change? We have the Climate and Green Plan, there's certain policies and acts. So got into some of the details of a local context. Again, this one was delivered cross-sectorally, lots of participation across different sectors, infrastructure, and whatnot, also very popular. Next slide, please. And then we started to dig into some of the very planning specific details. So you'll notice the attendance and the registrants started getting more focused. You'll notice Stephen here, who was our resident landscape architect, looks nothing like Homer Simpson, as I depicted in the previous slide, but they got into some of the more gritty pieces of what it means to be planning in the context of climate change. So next slide. And so here they started to talk about professional obligations. What does adaptation look like in the context of planning? What are the tools that they can use? What are the design tools and approaches that can be taken to help integrate climate change? Next slide. And finally, we got into one more detailed course that was really focused on the planning sector. And this one was the dollars and cents of climate change. And once again, it was a smaller crew, but it was because it was very focused on the planning community itself. And there was, in both of the last two that are very focused, there was lots of space for conversation. So next slide, for the dollars and cents one, the objectives was really, we talked about communicating to clients, and the importance of that is starting to understand the business case around adaptation and why it needs to be done, and how do you communicate that? How do you sort of internalize that and build that into your projects? So how do you make the case for protecting natural infrastructures, or how make the case for adaptation, and helping planners identify methodologies, tools, and approaches to improve this. Next slide. And just a few sort of reflections on the overall delivery of the course. It went really well. We did it all in a virtual context, which I don't even know if it needs to be said that in person is always a helpful approach. So hopefully there will be following steps to come up with sort of like in-person approaches. I think these are a little bit out of order, but I'll start with the Climate Change 101 was really successful. I think everybody who's starting to integrate climate change knows that they don't need to be a climate scientist, but they want to know what they don't know about climate science. And so one of the actions that we have right now is we're trying to clone Danny, so we can do a few more of them, especially as he's getting to retirement age, but for climate people, not biotech, so it's going slow. I think the other thing that was a really, really great success was sort of this unsiloing of the conversation in a couple of ways. So the MCRT, as we mentioned above, brought together different sectors, and we met regularly with all of the sectors. So we knew what was going on in engineering, we knew what was going on in Northern business and in the Indigenous one. And I think those conversations were really fruitful to know what other people were considering, and knowing that we didn't have to double back on certain things like the Climate 101. One thing that was a bit of a challenge, I think, was scoping the audience when we talked about having watershed planners and municipal planners into the planning group. There's lots of different, once you get into those detailed sessions like those last two, there's lots of things that are very specific that need to be touched on. And while there's really great conversations that can have across sectors and within some of those siloed sectors, creating the resources that are really detailed when it comes to planning and policy and regulation, it becomes a bit difficult. So just being aware of where you're at with respect to time and ability to adequately provide information that's necessary for a sector. And one of the things that we really relied on was case studies. People are really interested on what has worked and what hasn't worked in terms of climate solutions, and why hasn't it worked, or why has it worked. And I think those are kind of the key takeaways. I think there's lots of space for conversation in the future, and lots of work to be done on both that high level of getting people to access the 101 information and understand climate, but also getting into those more detailed conversations. Next slide. I'm done. Thank you so much for listening to me. Thank
Christy for this interesting presentation. I'm maybe I'm going to go with one clarification question for me again, and for you, Christy, as well. You did talk a bit about this, but someone is asking, just to confirm, are these training meant for planners of all kind, or are they more appropriate for urban planners specifically? Example, public health planner, transit planners, etc. So maybe quickly, if you can touch on that. Megan first, maybe.
Sure, yes, I was actually just typing a response to that. So with planning being having kind of not a hard definition, I'll just kind of explain it and saying yes, that it is meant for urban planners, or those working sort of in the development planning, policy planning space, but it would also include people who work specifically on something like transportation planning or environment planning and urban design and that kind of thing as well.
From our perspective, I would say that the first couple courses we provided were definitely broad scoped. As I mentioned, they were kind of attended by diverse sectors. As we got into the more detailed planning sessions, it was a bit more scoped into municipal planners and landscape architects, and to a lesser degree, some of the municipal decision makers. So yeah, part of the challenge is creating kind of those nuanced pieces of information, but definitely lots of work to be done, and we'll be happy to have a conversation about what those look like too. So
excellent, thanks. And Megan, you had another question on the justice module. I'll let you reply, but I believe it's not available yet, but I'll let you reply in the Q&A box. While I will now introduce our third and last presenter, Joe Rario. So Joe has been at the Memorial University of Newfoundland since 2015, and he's an associate professor in the Department of Civil Engineering. He earned his PhD in civil and environmental engineering at the University of Iowa, and his interest includes assessment of climate change impacts on natural and built infrastructure systems, and his research is focused on developing new methods to incorporate climate change uncertainty into infrastructure design. So Joe will talk about adapting to climate change and building infrastructure resilience from a Newfoundland and Labrador perspective. So you're on stage, Joe. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Dominique. So the first thing you'll notice from this and the slide and the introduction is that I am not a planner. Although I am involved with really with design of infrastructure systems and stormwater systems, which we've moved towards a planning. If you go to the next slide, please. Our project, our BRACE project, there you see the title, Building and Sustaining Infrastructure Resilience Through Enhanced Adaptation Training in Newfoundland and Labrador. Now the main purpose of our project was to train professional engineers, and in particular with tools and data and tools that were already available in the province, but weren't really being used as widely as they could have or should have been. And so the main focus was to develop the training modules, and we did quite a few of that. And I'll talk briefly about some of that. Excuse me. And then one of the other objectives was to create a community of practice, which we've done to an extent, and it's mostly localized in the province. That we've had our impact in the province primarily. Then our final one there was about getting this climate resilience into policy, and that was really the from the perspective of the government. You see our collaborators on this from Memorial, and we had a few other folks from Memorial, including climate scientists and some other folks. Then the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, PEGNL, which is professional engineers and geoscientists, which is regulates our licensing for engineers, Engineers Canada, municipalities, Newfoundland and Labrador, and then we had planners come in a little bit later in the project. This is the Newfoundland and Labrador Association of Professional Planners was part of our project as well. So next slide, please. So as I said, the main purpose of the project was to really train and make build awareness and make available existing tools which the province had, especially in terms of flood risk mapping and then coastal erosion data. Those were the primary things that were available, and we had a whole lot of climate change projections as well. With our most recent update being 2018, that's widely available. And again, I'll talk briefly about that. As this project moved forward, we kind of were learning about a lot of knowledge gaps. So there were a lot of existing tools, but we're also seeing that there was other training that wasn't going to be necessary. And I won't go over any of that in particular, in detail. But the biggest thing from this was recognizing, and I think this is the case nationwide, of course, but in particular in Newfoundland and Labrador, we've got a lot of really small communities with very limited resources, both in terms of financial resources available and technical expertise. They just don't have the capacity. So when we started getting more into the things that were more planning related, and this was in terms of methods and approaches where we can kind of optimize the use of whatever resources we have. So get the most out of limited information or limited financial and technical expertise to get a lot of this stuff done and make sure it's done well. And I'll go over that in a little more detail in the approach we went. I think that's pretty highly relevant to planning. Next slide, please. So we had several webinars, workshops. We've had, I think, 4 workshops now. I don't have all the topics here, but most of those was focused on training for professional engineers. Some of the big interest items for engineers was on legal liability and what the profession is required to do, what we should be required to do in terms of incorporating information on climate change into infrastructure design. We went over the science of climate change and climate modeling, which surprisingly didn't have much. The engineers didn't seem to have much interest in that, but that's a topic for the conversation. Went over some climate projections, talked about asset management, privacy protocol. That's a design protocol of climate change, mostly for risk and vulnerability assessments. And again, our flood risk mapping and coastal erosion. So that was kind of the early stuff. So if you'll, next slide, please. So just to kind of give you an overview. So the Geological Survey in the province has done a lot of monitoring and looking at landscape change, beach movement and coastal erosion, and really looking at what these implications are, especially with changing sea levels and rising sea levels, which is probably one of the biggest, most important things facing the Newfoundland and Labrador and a lot of the coastal areas, of course, in Canada, is sea level rise. Next slide, please. So just as an example here, this is Point Verde. So this structure you'll see is close to the beach. This is in 1995. Next slide, please. This is in 2003. And next slide. That's 2005. So if you toggle back to the 2 slides, you get a sense of what's going on. You can see where we're especially behind this structure where a lot of that erosion is taking place. So please, next slide. And it's hard to see from that angle. You can see the fence there in the background starting to hang off. Next slide. So we're here, you can't see behind it. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see what ultimately happens to this. There it is. It's now on the beach. And so this is a problem that's, of course, throughout the province. And we've seen it, well, of course, if you watch the news at all with Fiona hitting Port aux Basques, that was where the damage was right along the coast, and these houses were washed away. It was essentially coastal erosion was the key driver there. Next slide, please. And just this is a 3D elevation model that the province developed. This is actually a mistaken point. So if you're not familiar, this is on the south coast of the Avalon. This is I think a heritage site. It's a national park. There's fossils here, very old fossils. Some of the oldest fossils in the world are in this area. But I show this here just to show where the province does this coastal monitoring using drones and LiDAR data, collect LiDAR data, where once you get a baseline, they can really look at rates of erosion and coastal erosion. Of course, this area doesn't have a lot of development, but in areas where there's a lot of development, and I'll talk about one particular area, this is extremely, extremely important. Next slide, please. The other tools that were available and are still available are flood risk, and this, of course, is important for planners to have updated flood risk maps based on projections with the newer rainfall amounts. Next slide, please. I just wanted to show this. This is This is on the government website, so you can do a search, you can find these. There's a whole load of these that the province has done. This is just an example of what the website shows. So these were all the tools that were already available that weren't being weren't being used well enough. And we covered a lot of this. Next slide, please. So these are our climate change projections, which I actually have all these data that are available. This is just temperatures, and the IDF stations are where we have actually weather stations where we have precipitation and develop our IDFs, our intensity, duration, frequency curves, which represent rainfall, which are used for design. Next slide. This shows intensity changes where you can see there's going to be increases which have implications. So next slide, please. Really, after going through this, I'm sorry about this one. This one is all some of the other climate indices that are all available for use, which are useful obviously for planning. Next slide, please. So as I moved through these workshops, it became clear how important just addressing uncertainty, because with design, there's always uncertainty, and climate change just adds more uncertainty. And so I kind of started moving towards scenario planning approach or scenario analysis approach, where you can build in adaptive capacity through potential pathways depending on your scenarios. And so this is where we really got into the more planning aspects, and we're still working on this. We have another set of workshops set up for later in this fall with municipalities that are dealing more with municipal folks, with folks that represent municipalities and decision makers, and less geared towards professional engineers. Next slide, please. So this is one of the things we're trying to avoid, right? This is in Pooch Cove, this culvert. That's a house, and that's a pretty big culvert. These are some of my students I had working on a project in Pooch Cove, which is north of St. John's. I'll show you the map in a second. So these are kind of the ad hoc things that tend to happen. And the homeowner, I believe, indicated that thing flows full at times. Next slide, please. So we had a number of projects that weren't funded through NRCan. The one at Bay Bulls was funded through NRCan, but we've got Bay Bulls and Pooch Cove, which are on the east coast there, the Avalon, and then another set of projects on the Baccaloo Trail region, where there was a set of projects around Brigus, Carboneer, a small point, Adams Cove. We've got a number of things here where we've talked with communities and tried to implement the approach, this watershed approach. Next slide, please, to look at and address infrastructure planning, essentially. So we take the watershed approach where we look at our entire stormwater system and not just one piece of infrastructure. And there you see, this was a model we use, and you see the watershed in the middle of Bay Bulls. And in the interest of time, next slide, please. And so here's our model set up. So those yellow lines are conduits, or either open channels or closed channels. And on the right there, that culvert is actually down. If you go to the lower part of the image on the left, the red triangle that's going into the bay there is where that outlet is. And so one of the issues here was that the development that you see on kind of in the center right there, there's a relatively new development. And it was not planned, and there was actually turned out to be a transfer of water from in that basin, which actually exacerbated problems downstream, which a planning approach would, of course, eliminate. Next slide, please. So what we do is we develop these models, and this is just to show the light blue areas are areas where there's flooding represented here. And so the idea is to take the entire watershed as a system, and so here we've identified a lot of areas where there's flooding, and then we can implement in conjunction with folks in the municipalities potential solutions, potential scenarios, using nature-based solutions, natural infrastructure, whatever the case may be, where if we have a case like this, and go to the next slide, please, we could get something that looks like this. We have multiple failures. The image there on the left is is one of my favorites that shows really a complete lack of resilience, where not only does the culvert come out, but the backhoe goes into drink too once we're trying to fix it. But in order to avoid these kind of situations, next slide, please. If we go in and we use the model to make changes in the watershed and store water, upgrade or adjust infrastructure throughout the system, use more nature-based solutions, we can then go in and reduce vulnerabilities, reduce flooding, and reduce the risk of those kind of failures occurring. Next slide, please. And so this is kind of our, if you're not familiar with scenario analysis, just kind of gives us a different viewpoint where we can actually try to lean towards the preferable outcomes. And we won't get into the details here. So just go to the next slide. And by way of conclusion, again, I think the key here is when we're thinking about planning, I have here planning with uncertainty, but in a lot of ways, we're planning for the uncertainty. We have to think about, because we just don't know what's going to happen. We have to keep that in mind. And we can't always quantify that. And that's tends to be called deep uncertainty, which is more qualitative, which, deals with questions of how our individuals, communities, et cetera, are going to deal with unknowns or uncertainties. And then we can allow us to bring in different modes of knowledge, local knowledge and how uncertainty may be preferred to be managed with. And I think process, how this is done, is really, really important. So moving forward is working with communities to get agreement through this scenario planning process, and really see that uncertainty really is an opportunity to get things right, because we don't, try and, from an engineering perspective, it tends to be hard structure as well. From a planning perspective, we can do a lot better, I think. So that's it for me. I think I'm a little bit over. I apologize for that, but take any questions.
Oh, good, Joe. Thanks. And thanks for ending on this positive note about uncertainty and how important it is to still move forward, even if there's a lot of uncertainty. Thanks. And we still have, well, I would say great. And thank you for the three presenters. And I'm looking at the time. We still have 7 minutes for the Q&A period. So if you have any questions, it's time to add them to the Q&A box. And if, as I mentioned, if we're not able to get to all of them today, we'll get back to the question and we'll send the answers through the email that will follow this webinar. So 2 questions were asked, and I believe Christy and Megan, you answered these questions, but I would like to come back to these questions because I think it's relevant to all the participants, and I don't know if everybody had the chance to look at it, but if even though the training and modules are oriented towards Ontario and Manitoba, is it still worth watching, attending if you are from elsewhere? And just to summarize, one of the answers is that many of these courses have specific content. For example, provincial policy and specific adaptation examples, but a lot of the content and concepts are broad enough to be of interest to many folks. So I think that's an important point. And someone was asking about, there was an interest in using some of the courses to customize to other regions. So I think that's also an important point that Brace is trying to promote, so that we don't start again and create over and over the same content, but we use what's already there and we adapt to other fields, other professions, so I don't know, Christy, Megan, and even Joe, if you have something to add on this.
Well, I'll say, pardon me, that we have a lot of the training materials available and recordings right now. We've got some sites, but we've had some issues. So if you're interested, just contact me, and I can either I can make a lot of this stuff available through NRCan, but there's still some cleaning up we need to do to make these fully available, which we've got till the end of the year. So, but yes, they're relevant. There are some things that are relevant nationwide for sure.
Yeah, I would just echo Joe's comment. I think all of the Manitoba Climate Resilience Training content is available on the Climate West website. So you can see any of the sessions that were hosted, they're all recorded, but lots of content through the planning sector, as well as all of the other sectors that would be relevant to other areas, and especially with respect to taking the content and modifying it into something that fits your regional context a bit better. I think the approach to developing it would be a similar process for everyone, kind of thinking through audience and regional context. So yes, I would say definitely go check it out.
Thank you. We have another interesting question here. So scenario-based approach, do you face challenges with capacity turnover? I find this quite interesting. My experience is that for those who participate, they're on board, but for those who was not there or comes in later, they struggle to follow the thread, limiting the update of recommendation. Have you faced this? How did you overcome it? Joe?
I can try to answer that. We've faced it, and we haven't overcome it yet. So that's, we're still early days in this, right? When and quite frankly, a lot of the projects that I'm working on were heavily interrupted by COVID because so much this requires, it doesn't work on virtually. So it is a problem, and I don't have an answer as how to overcome it. It's something that is questions we do have moving into our last set of workshops that we're doing in next month, I think. Sorry.
Again, Christy, anything to add about turnover?
Something that I will say is that once we complete the training, we don't have currently in place anything to follow up to see like how that information has been disseminated. So it'd be very interesting to see how people are using that information and whether or not they're sort of taking it and then presenting it to their internal teams. So I'm not really sure, to be honest, whether or not there is sort of that turnover or that capacity issue, but certainly something worth exploring.
Yeah, and I can just add, turnover is obviously an issue with certain project funded approaches. As we noted, I didn't lead the project on our team, although gladly happy to speak to it. But I think there is, as Megan noted, kind of thinking through the long term and how people are accessing and where does the information go from here. One of the long-term conversations we had with MCRT was how to make things evergreen as well, because they're going to live on the site for a while and things are going to change around them. So lots of elements to think through in terms of kind of how to keep it going in a manner that works.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, I agree also the monitoring and evaluating the success and how these training get used and incorporated in profession is tricky to do. Thanks to all. There's only 2 minutes left, so let's go with one quick question. So and again, we'll reply to all questions at the end, just want to remind that, but what one ingredient would each panelist suggest has been critical to their respective success in building planners' capacity to understand climate risk resilience and adaptation? One ingredient. So I'll start with you, Christy. I have you on my screen.
Ingredient, hey? I like it. There's more than one, I think, but one of the things that I thought was very fruitful was the facilitated dialogue between sectors was, I think, really helpful in the MCRT project. And even within the planning project, the conversation between watershed planners and municipal decision makers, professional planners, there's so many like intersecting points in those, but they often don't talk, is what I found. We were introducing people who worked at the government that did watershed versus municipal stuff. So I think that's a huge piece, especially as you get into like the guts of the conversation once you're past the Climate 101 and getting that piece in. But yeah, my ingredient there.
Great, Megan.
I would say that it's letting people know that no matter what it is that you're working on, that there are opportunities to incorporate climate change action or just learning. And so really enabling people to recognize that in their own role, I think is probably the biggest thing.
Great, thanks. And Joe, quickly.
Well, I don't know, quite frankly. I think I really can't think of anything except that talking about climate change, like I said at the end, I think it's using it as an opportunity to do things better. And that's, I think that's a difficult message to get out, but it really, I think that's the only way forward, quite frankly. I don't know if that helps, but.
Great, thanks. It's great timing. It's 2. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, including, of course, our presenters. If you're interested in exploring additional resources, we have a slide. Yeah, we put some resources here. And so you're welcome to have a look at these links. And we would appreciate also if you could take a few minutes to fill the evaluation form. You'll see the link on the other slide, and Claire will add the link to the chat. And it will also be included when you receive the package of the slides by email. And please join us for the next webinar. As I mentioned at the beginning, it will be on October 11th, and it's going to be key considerations for upskilling the workforce of tomorrow. And the registration will be launched soon with other topics to follow shortly thereafter. So on that, it's 2:01. So I thank you all. Merci à tous. Je vous souhaite une bonne semaine, and hoping to see you on our next webinar. Have a nice day. Thanks.